Let's move on then to the final objective for today's class. This again flows nicely from what we were covering before in terms of inclusive leadership, of what it is, and perhaps your own personal blind spots, which you would have identified by now. So ideally, I wanted you to take the IAT test before we move on here. So while we explain how to create an inclusive leadership culture, you can perhaps start thinking and reflecting about your own personal blind spots or personal biases at least, and how that can be applicable when you try to create an inclusive leadership culture. So let's move directly into it. How can we create an inclusive leadership culture? Well, it's not easy, right? And it's much easier said than done as well, because it takes energy and deliberate effort to create an inclusive culture, which starts with leaders paying much more attention to what they say and do on a daily basis so that they can make adjustments that become routine in their daily interactions at work. We know that based on everything we covered so far, we can categorize four ways, hence the reason I put four persons down here, four ways for leaders to get started. The first way is to know your inclusive leadership shadow. The second way is to be visible and vocal, building upon what we just did. Third is to deliberately seek out differences, which again builds on what we just did in terms of your personal biases and seeking out others, collaborating with others, and so on. And finally, monitoring, which means checking your impact. Are you actually being inclusive? So we're going to be very practical here and hands on. Let's take a look at the first one, knowing your inclusive leadership shadow. What does this look like exactly? Well, this guy says, this employee in particular says, Jeff sought feedback from me on whether I perceive them as inclusive. Great. That signals that diversity and inclusion are important to him. I like how Jeff regularly asks me how he can make me feel more included. What a cool guy. So, what does this mean then, if we to break it down? Essentially, is to seek feedback on whether you are perceived as inclusive, especially from people who are different from you. This will help you to identify your blind spots, your strengths, the areas where you need more development, perhaps, and it will also signal, as you saw here, to others that diversity and inclusion are important to you. So right away, that communicates that says that you have that sort of visible commitment to diversity. You can even schedule regular check-ins with members of your team to ask them how you can make them feel more included, which also sends that message as well. So it's very participative in a sense. You're allowing employees to be empowered and have a say in understanding so that you could better understand your inclusive leadership shadow. Okay, and I thought these speech bubbles made it very easy to understand the concept, hence the reason I included it in a very practical way, if not a bit hilarious. Okay, the second one is to be visible and vocal. So this employee said, I love when Jeff of course being the CEO or the leader, the hypothetical leader that we're using in this case, I love when Jeff told that compelling and explicit personal story on why inclusiveness is important to him. When we speak about being visible and vocal, try to tell some sort of compelling and explicit narrative or develop it at least on why being inclusive is important to you and then communicate that out there, right? Personally, within your business or on social media, doesn't have to be vocally, right? Although that will, of course, be fine as well. So you're trying to tell that compelling story and develop that narrative, then communicate that narrative of why inclusivity is important to you. One example, very practically, is you can share your personal stories at conferences, at public forums, on LinkedIn, right? That we spoke about before. People often do that on LinkedIn, actually, explaining which conference they were part of. So not just a matter of being at the conference, but then posting about it on your professional networks. So you're creating that visibility and showing that you are very much vocal about inclusivity. Third, deliberately seek out differences. This employee says, as a minority who identifies as a flying octopus, I was so happy when Jeff invited me to contribute to this project. He even made sure that I was given an opportunity to speak up at the last meeting. Ignoring the very silly example here, giving people on the periphery of your network a chance to speak up, inviting different people to the table and to catch up with the broader network. So those in the minority, right? Those in the minority could be, of course, surface level or even deep level diversity. When we speak about personality differences, perhaps someone who's a bit more quiet or introverted at meetings, sort of giving them that chance to speak up in more comfortable settings, seeking out opportunities to work with persons from those minority groups, and perhaps even creating teams that are multidisciplinary or cross-functional to leverage different strengths of different individuals. That, of course, is how we can include those who are a bit different or in the minority to ensure that they are, well, exactly that, included, right? Finally, check your impact. As Jeff's trusted advisor, I am happy to report that his approach to diversity is influencing others to do the same. Very, very impactful statement here. That said, I informed Jeff that he needs to seek out input from the younger professionals who seem to be in a minority in Jeff's network. So what is happening here is that essentially we're saying that you should look for signals that you're having a positive impact. Are people copying your role modeling, right? So this is exactly what the advisor was saying here. So you're asking somebody who's a trusted advisor at work, somebody who can give you candid feedback on areas you've been working on. Perhaps it might be your secretary, perhaps it might be a colleague, a good friend at work, just somebody who can give you some candid feedback. And this person can give you feedback on the extent to which other employees are modeling your inclusive behaviors. Are more diverse employees sharing ideas with you? Are persons who are in perhaps the minority, as you just spoke about, or who won't typically coming forward to you now and starting to speak to you? These are all signals you can look for to determine whether you are actually making an impact. We can also try to ascertain whether people are working together more collaboratively. Do we have people from, do we see that greater collaboration existing in the workplace as well? So the point here is that you're generally trying to monitor your impact in a variety of ways. One of these ways, of course, being that you can have a trusted advisor to give you that candid feedback on the extent to which your inclusivity is being modeled by others, and others are, in fact, being more inclusive in their own actions, so being more collaborative and so on. Okay. These are four very practical, hands-on ways you can implement inclusivity at work from a leadership perspective. I did not include it in the slides here, but I thought a very nice comprehensive example of how you can build an inclusive culture. Of course, this is exactly what we're talking about here, right? Creating that culture. How you can build it even in meetings. And you might think, well, meetings, is that an important way? Is that one of those crucial ways where we can build cultures? Well, one thing that has not changed over the years, even though we've started to gather virtually across time zones, often working with far less face time than before, one thing that has remained consistent is that, for better or for worse, meetings are still one of the prime venues to build and foster a fully inclusive culture, because that's one of the things that has remained constant, right? So you want to engage and equip people to do the very best at work, and meetings are one of those ways where we can try to even create an inclusive culture. So how can you do it in a very practical way? This is sort of a side note based on some of the very points we just covered actually, from both this objective and the previous objective, okay? So one thing you can do, review the list of attendees, those who are coming. Are you missing people who represent diverse or dissenting points of view? That is absolutely something you want to check for to determine whether those persons in those groups are starting to be absent at meetings because they feel as perhaps as though they have not been included in the past. Another action you can use at meetings is to greet each meeting participant warmly by name so everyone feels welcome. I remember being in a meeting once, a faculty board meeting, and a particular dean actually did that and walked around and said, hey, and even the current dean did it at one point, walked around to everybody and said, hey, how are you doing? Hey, Paul, how was the latest? Greeting everybody by first name so they feel warmly rather than just sitting at the head of the table and starting the meeting immediately, and it could come across a bit cool, right? So the idea is you're trying to ensure that everybody feels welcome, and perhaps those who are in the minority groups or those who are perhaps more introverted or feel as though they are not being heard would be more likely to speak up in this comfortable environment. You can even state ground rules up front. at a meeting and make sure that those rules explicitly foster inclusion. A nice idea as well is to mediate and facilitate, to keep track of who's talking, yes, but also who's not talking. And this is also important in a classroom, of course. And the idea is you don't want to have any sort of tolerance for interruptions. So prevent anyone from dominating or even derailing discussions at times. Because again, that shuts down persons who are providing perhaps a dissenting point of view or who are from a minority group. And finally, follow up after the meeting. Thank participants for attending. Ask for their feedback following some of the very same principles we just spoke about. This can certainly go a long way towards building an inclusive culture. There's one final way I did not mention because we did it in our previous class, and that is perspective taking, right? So we did perspective taking before, where you had to pair up with one of your colleagues and write about a day in their life to try to understand their background. And I said, try to be as specific as you can. I'm writing about a few lines on the challenges that they may face, what their life is like, and so on. And that, of course, has been shown in as well to help create inclusive culture. So it's not just important for building empathy and emotional intelligence, but also for empathetic teams. Right? Those that engaged in perspective taking can help, were found to actually have more positive attitudes and behaviors towards minorities, and it increased support engaging in less mistreatment towards marginalized minorities, which should come as no surprise because if you did the activity with us last week, you'd realize that it helps you to better put yourself in other people's shoes and thus minimize the kind of biases you might have towards other persons, perhaps of a different background or different demographic, right? And I'm sure you can think about that from your own examples that we did. So, in conclusion, leaders who consciously practice inclusive leadership and try to actively, which is hard work, develop their capability, will see results in superior performance of their diverse teams. Those results are likely to be via higher innovation, engagement and attendance, and leadership effectiveness, which we know all impact financial performance and, of course, directly impacting financial performance as well. So there certainly is value for developing diversity. We understand 6 actions we can use for building that for being an inclusive leader, and then how we can apply those in 4 distinct ways to create an inclusive leadership culture. Okay, so I hope you found the class useful. We'll move on then to close off today's class with our student learning portfolio. And I made a very minor adjustment to it. So just be aware of that. I'll highlight the adjustment as well. You are a supervisor at a fairly large organization. Choose a type of organization, example bank, specific retailer, manufacturer, etc. You recently received word from the CEO that diversity initiatives are to be prioritized. With reference to your chosen organization, give examples, and your leadership behaviors, which we have covered today in greater detail. Explain how you would create an inclusive culture. And that's a key part of the question there. When you are thinking about it, this is the part that I added on, I also want you to think about, do you have any implicit biases that can influence your initiatives? And what I want you to refer to would be your IAT results from today's class, which would in total take you about 40 minutes to complete if you do 2 of them, but at least do 1. Ideally, I would ask you to do 2, as I said earlier. So I want you to reference those biases, implicit biases that you may have, and when you reflect on those biases, the degree to which they can influence your initiatives when you start creating these initiatives and what you can do. So this gives you the opportunity to engage in a very rich reflection based on today's class on how you would create an inclusive culture at your chosen organization. Okay? So I think there's a fantastic question that will capture everything we did today, including the IIT tests that you did between the second and the third objective. All right, thank you.